Is the Series S holding back gaming? Well, sort of. Games are developed for what's called a target platform. That is the console or PC hardware that the game is primarily being developed for. Now, if you're developing a game for a hardware that is much more powerful and you want to then later move that game or get it to run on hardware that's lower end, it can be difficult making sure that that game that's scaled to that powerful hardware to scale it down and make it smaller to run on that lower end hardware. A good example of this is the PS3, Xbox 360 era games, where a lot of games were made for the PS3 and even the PS2 and Xbox and GameCube. A lot of games were made for those home consoles, but publishers wanted those games to be on as many platforms as possible. When you wanted to get a PlayStation 3 or a PlayStation 2 game and get it to run on something like a Game Boy Advance, well, frankly, it just wasn't possible most of the time because the Game Boy Advance was a console designed to run 2D games, and most of the PlayStation 2 and the PlayStation 3 games were 3D games. With the PlayStation 3, high definition 3D games. Just grabbing a game and moving it towards the Game Boy Advance, porting it, it wasn't going to really run well. And so what a lot of game developers used to do back then, and this is less common now, is that they would have the game on the Game Boy Advance, but and it would often have the same name even, but really it was two different games, right? So they would make one game for the PlayStation 2 or PlayStation 3, depending on the era, and then they would make another game for the Game Boy Advance or the Nintendo DS, depending on the era. And these games were totally different. They were completely different, even if they had the same name, even if the game was like, I don't know, Chicken Little the movie or Shrek the movie, the game, right? Shrek the movie, the game on PlayStation 2, whatever that was going to be very different than Shrek the movie, the game on Game Boy Advance. And this has been something that we have been seeing even as far back as the Super Nintendo Game Boy era. You know, you had home console games on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. And then you had handheld games on the original Game Boy, which launched originally in 1989. Pretty old boy, the big brick Game Boy. And if you remember that, the Game Boy couldn't do anything. Like, it couldn't do what the Super Nintendo and the Genesis could do. It could only output like four colors, right? The screens were like these monochrome, sort of grayish, black and whitish, you know, and so you weren't really getting the same experience despite the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy both being 2D gaming platforms. A lot of those games just needed to be shrunken in such a way that it felt very different on the Game Boy or completely different than what you were getting on the Super Nintendo. So let's move back to the Series S. The Series S is not a Game Boy. It's not a Nintendo DS. It is a home console, right? But it is weaker in key parts. The graphics chip, which we call the GPU, how much RAM, how much memory it has, is smaller than what the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X has. And the CPU is basically the same. But the biggest difference is the RAM. You know, how much RAM is available for games. The PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X have a total of 16 gigs of RAM, while the Xbox Series S has around 10 gigs, and that's a big difference. Whenever you're making a PlayStation 5 game, then, right, if you're targeting, like I said before, lead platform, if you're targeting the PlayStation 5 as the lead platform, and oftentimes PlayStation is the lead platform because PlayStation is the highest selling console and it has been since the PlayStation 1. The only time that wasn't the case was during the PS3 when Nintendo managed to outpace them with the Nintendo Wii. But other than that, the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5 have all been the best selling home consoles. Now the Nintendo Switch is doing really well, but the Nintendo Switch is like, it's like a handheld that you can also, it's like a hybrid console. It's not one to one. So if you're making a game, your primary platform is probably going to be the platform where you're going to make the most money. And that platform likely is the one that has the highest number of users. In this case, it's the PlayStation 5. So you're making a PlayStation 5 game, right? But you also want to get it out elsewhere. You want to put it on PC, right? Which isn't really, that's not that big of a challenge. For example, like, I don't know, like PCs, some PCs can't run the game well. It's not a big deal because some people have PCs that are slow, super slow. Other people have PCs that are okay, like me, and other people have PCs that are like on the real high end, right? So you can just target the people that have okay PCs, excuse me, and have high end PCs, right? But with Xbox, there's two consoles: the Series X and the Series S. You can't just and Microsoft has a mandate, by the way. They have a mandate that if you make an Xbox Series X game, it has to also run on the Xbox Series S. So if you want to get your game on as many platforms as possible, you're building your game like most games built for the PlayStation 5 first. That is the lead platform. That is the target platform, right? If you're doing that and you're trying to then later on in development trying to then squeeze that game so that it could run on the smaller, lower end Series S, you could run into problems. And this is something that we've seen for games like Baldur's Gate 3. There have been a host of games that had difficulties trying to get the game to run on Series S because those games, frankly, and you could say unfortunately, are not being designed with the Series S as the target platform, as the lead platform, right? They're being designed for PlayStation 5. And PlayStation 5, there is a power differential between the Series S and the PlayStation 5. It's kind of like grabbing a game that's made for the PlayStation 5, like let's say like, I don't know, Star Wars Outlaws, and grabbing that game and then trying to port it, trying to squeeze it so that it can run on the Nintendo Switch. The difference in power between the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 5 is vast. Most of the time, you're just not going to be able to do that. The only other option would be to go the old school Game Boy way, where you make a completely different game for the Nintendo Switch. Now, there's a lot of games that the Nintendo Switch can run that are home console games, but PlayStation 5 games have proven to be very difficult. And this is why a lot of the games you see, like for example, Star Wars Outlaws, right? For example, Avatar, Frontiers of Pandora, Alan Wake 2, Cyberpunk, right? And Cyberpunk was a cross-gen, that was also on PS4 originally. So you'd think that would have a greater chance of running on Switch, but no. Because the Switch is below the PlayStation 4, below the Xbox One, and now that we have the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, it's much harder to get those games. If you couldn't get those games to fit on the PlayStation 4, like Avatar, Frontiers of Pandora, right, and Star Wars Outlaws, then imagine getting them to run on the Switch. And this is kind of the mini conundrum that the Series S is. Now you could say, well, V4, right? There is a bunch of Switch games that look great, and there's a bunch of Switch games that again are on home console, and they're also on Switch. Like, and there's games like, for example, Nintendo games that look fantastic. Like even to this day, an old game, if you can believe that, an old game like Breath of the Wild looks really good on the Nintendo Switch. Something like Mario Odyssey looks good. It's a good-looking game, you know. Any of Nintendo's latest games, they're lookers, and they know how to take advantage of the Switch and optimize for the Switch. But you know what Nintendo's doing there? They're making the Switch the target platform. That's right. They're not developing for PS5. They're not developing for Series S. They're developing for Switch, right? And that's the key. So if developers really want to solve the problem of Series S compatibility, then they would have to build for the Series S as the target platform and then scale upwards towards the Series X, scale upwards towards the PlayStation 5. That's the way that you have a solid experience on Series S. That's the way that you don't go halfway through development and go, uh-oh, turns out we can't get all this stuff that we worked on before to fit on the Series S or the Nintendo Switch or whatever. And that's the key issue. And this is something that, I mean, honestly, like, if I were developing a game and I really wanted Xbox support, I would make sure that that game is running on the Series S at the very least at 30 FPS in some way, shape, or form early in development. I wouldn't want to run into issues later. But fundamentally, it is not Xbox that's selling a bunch of units right now, right? Like consoles. It is PlayStation 5. And so developers have a business incentive to go where the money is. And sometimes you're seeing it now, even PC is a target platform because Steam has gotten so huge. So it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. If the Series S and the Xbox Series X were the best selling consoles this generation, you wouldn't be really worrying about this because chances are the Series S would be the target platform. But because it's once again PlayStation, this is what you get. And it's unfortunate for people that have an Xbox Series S. I have a Series X myself, you know, and a PS5 and a PC. But it is unfortunate that, you know, somebody has to get the short end of the stick. I just hope that with time, developers are going to get better, and they're gonna have better tooling to be able to get their games to run on Series S better. So is the Series S holding back games? Well, sort of. Yeah, as I said earlier, if you have to design games so that they can run on Series S, then you have to make some compromises. Oftentimes, the word for compromises that we use whenever we're happy about the compromises is game optimization, right? And that's where essentially devs go. It's the equivalent of devs going into like a PC game settings menu and then like turning down the settings, right? Oftentimes that's what it is. Sometimes it's getting nitty gritty with the code. Sometimes it's going from like using like UE4 blueprints to using like, you know, better code. But generally that's what it is. And so if you do make these games from the ground up with the Series S as the lead platform, are those games going to be sort of held back compared to if they were made for the PlayStation 5 as the lead platform? And the answer is, yeah, probably. And it depends on the game, and it depends on it's a case-by-case basis. But chances are that, you know, there are going to have to be compromises. You look at something like Divinity Original Sin 2, that came out, you know, a while back. That game is a co-op game, just like Baldur's Gate 3. That game is basically Baldur's Gate 2.5. Like it's very similar, made by the same developers. Yet that could run on PS4, that could run on Xbox One, and you have something like Baldur's Gate 3 that cannot run on those consoles. So what's the difference? Well, with Baldur's Gate 3, the target platform, the lead platform was, as I understand it, PC, right? And it was newer PCs than what was Divinity Original Sin 2. Right? So even if something like Divinity Original Sin 2 could run just fine on an Xbox One, it does not mean, or a PS4, it does not mean that that next generational spiritual successor of that game, like Baldur's Gate 3, was going to run well on the Series S, despite the Series S being significantly stronger than a Xbox One. And why is that? It's because Baldur's Gate 3 system requirements are higher than Divinity Original Sin 2's. Now you can look at Divinity Original Sin and you can play it and you can be all like, well, this is a pretty similar experience. Like maybe the graphics are better in Baldur's Gate 3, but it feels kind of similar, and it really does. But what's going on in the background, like you look at something like the number of NPCs that Baldur's Gate 3 has, the memory footprint of that game is bigger. Like there's all these factors that make it so that the Series S, frankly, the Series S just wasn't really accounted for when Baldur's Gate 3 was being developed. Because if it was, you know, if it really was, then they wouldn't have ran into these issues of, oh, all of a sudden we can't get the game out on this console because we're having all these issues, right? So if they do make these games for the Series S instead of the PS5, chances are there's going to be compromises. And those compromises, if you want to look at it, you know, critically, yeah, you could actually see those compromises as games being held back. But I think that the experience would be overall better for pretty much everyone involved, because those games are going to run well on a Series S. Those games are going to run well on a PS5, even better on PS5 and Xbox Series X, and even better on PC. And there are ways that you can make games that are scalable. You look at something like Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk on PC runs on the most potato of PCs just fine. You run that game. I think you could probably, well, you can definitely run that game on something like a 1050, which is a potato GPU. And you could scale that game and you can add, settings, and there's transformative things like adding ray tracing. Then there's, at the high end, path tracing, right? And it gets to the point where even like at the beginning, you can have something like a 1050, and a 1050 can run the game fine enough. And yet, if you pump everything up, it's to the point where even a 4090 is struggling to run everything, right? And the game looks gorgeous. Like, it has some of the best lighting ever, like with the path trace version of the game. And so, is Cyberpunk being held back by the fact that it has to run on a 1050? Or the fact that it had to run on a PS4? Sure. But did the game need to stay looking like a typical PS4 game? Could it not have gone beyond? Could it not have pushed higher while still being compatible with lower end machines? Absolutely it could, and absolutely it did. Now, maybe not all devs can do that. Maybe not all devs want to put the resources into making like path trace versions of their games, right? Not every game is Alan Wake 2 or Cyberpunk, right? Or apparently the new Indiana Jones, which is also going to have a path trace version. So, sure, but it is possible. It is possible, and there are games that, do it beautifully. So, I don't think that the answer is yes, the Series S absolutely is 100%, and all games are going to look terrible, it's all going to be bad. But I think that in some cases, some games would have to reduce their scope. And they would have to look worse, right? And other cases, like games could be like Cyberpunk or like Alan Wake 2 and look fantastic on the high end while still being able to run on machines that could never handle, like, those really high end settings. So it's a complicated answer, but I think it's an accurate one. So yes, the answer is sort of. I have a video that's going to go into more detail in terms of games, in terms of how can the Series S get games like, for example, Hellblade 2, which looks fantastically on the Series S. It's one of the best looking games to this day. Like, it's incredible. At times, it's photorealistic. How can you get something like Hellblade 2, but you can't, get something, like lower end, something that's not even that good looking, like Baldur's Gate 3, right? And there's reasons for that. And that's something that I explore in that video. So I'll be putting that out soon. Stay tuned. Thank you. And like and subscribe as well if you can. This is a new channel, just starting out. Really appreciate it. Take care, guys.